All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I believe we're on episode 79. I think this is our last episode in the 70s. We are continuing to read Angela Y. Davis's Women, Race, and Class. I believe we're on the second to last chapter. This chapter is entitled Racism, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights. We are on page 215, middle of page 215. The abortion rights activists of the early 1970s should have examined the history of their movement. Had they done so, they might have understood why so many of their black sisters adopted a posture of suspicion toward their cause. They might have understood how important it was to undo the racist deeds of their predecessors who had advocated birth control as well as compulsory sterilization as a means of eliminating the quote, unfit, end quote, sectors of the population. Consequently, the young white feminists might have been more receptive to the suggestion that their campaign for abortion rights include a vigorous condemnation of sterilization abuse, which had become more widespread than ever. It was not until the media decided that the casual sterilization of 2 black girls in Montgomery, Alabama was a scandal worth reporting that the Pandora's box of sterilization abuse was finally flung open. But by the time the case of the Relf sisters broke, it was practically too late to influence the politics of the abortion rights movement. Excuse me, get this mic situated. It was the summer of 1973, and the Supreme Court decision legalizing abortions had already been announced in January. Nevertheless, the urgent need for mass opposition to sterilization abuse became tragically clear. The facts surrounding the Relf sisters' story was horrifyingly simple. Minnie Lee, who was 12 years old, and Mary Alice, who was 14, had been unsuspectingly carted into an operating room where surgeons irrevocably robbed them of their capacity to bear children. The surgery had been ordered by the HEW-funded Montgomery Community Action Committee after it was discovered that Depo-Provera, a drug previously administered to the girls as a birth prevention measure, caused cancer in test animals. After the Southern Poverty Law Center filed suit on behalf of the Relf sisters, the girls' mothers revealed that she had unknowingly, quote, consented, end quote, to the operation, having been deceived by the social workers who handled her daughter's case. They had asked Mrs. Relf, who was unable to read, to put her, quote, X, end quote, on a document, the contents of which were not described to her. She assumed, she said, that it authorized the continued Depo-Provera injections. As she subsequently learned, she had authorized the surgical sterilization of her daughters. In the aftermath of the publicity exposing the Relf sisters' case, similar episodes were brought to light. In Montgomery alone, 11 girls, also in their teens, had been similarly sterilized by the HEW-funded birth control clinics in other states, as it turned out, had also subjected young girls to sterilization abuse. Moreover, individual women came forth with equally outrageous stories. Niall Ruth Cox, for example, filed suit against the state of North Carolina. At the age of 18, 8 years before the suit, officials had threatened to discontinue her family's welfare payments if she refused to submit to surgical sterilization. Before she assented to the operation, she was assured that her infertility would be temporary. Niall Ruth Cox's lawsuit was aimed at a state which had diligently practiced the theory of eugenics. Under the auspices of the Eugenics Commission of North Carolina, so it was learned, 7,686 sterilizations have been carried out since 1933. Wow. Although the operations were justified as measures to prevent the reproduction of, quote, mentally deficient persons, end quote, about 5,000 of the sterilized persons have been black. According to Brenda Fagan-Faustu, the ACLU attorney representing Niall Ruth Cox, North Carolina's recent record was not much better. Quote, as far as I can determine, the statistics reveal that since 1964, Approximately 65% of the women sterilized in North Carolina were black, and approximately 35% were white. End quote. As the flurry of publicity exposing sterilization abuse revealed, the neighboring state of South Carolina had been the site of further atrocities. 18 women from Aiken, South Carolina, charged that they had been sterilized by a Dr. Clovis Pierce during the early 1970s. The sole obstetrician in that small town, Pierce had consistently sterilized Medicaid recipients with 2 or more children. According to a nurse in his office, Dr. Pierce insisted that pregnant welfare women, quote, will have to submit to voluntary sterilization, end quote, if they wanted him to deliver their babies. While he was, quote, tired of people running around and having babies and paying for them with my taxes, end quote. Dr. Pierce received some $60,000 in taxpayers' money for the sterilization he performed. During his trial, he was supported by the South Carolina Medical Association, whose members declared that doctors, quote, have a moral and legal right to insist on sterilization permission before accepting a patient if it is done on the initial visit, end quote. Revelations of sterilization abuse during that time exposed the complicity of the federal government. At first, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare claimed that approximately 16,000 women and 8,000 men have been sterilized in 1972 under the auspices of federal programs. Later, however, these figures underwent a drastic revision. Carl Schultz, director of HEW's Population Affairs Office, estimated that between 100,000 and 200,000 sterilizations had actually been funded that year by the federal government. During Hitler's Germany, incidentally, 250,000 sterilizations were carried out under the Nazis' hereditary health law. It is possible that the record of the Nazis throughout the years of their reign may have been almost equaled by U.S. government-funded sterilizations in the space of a single year. And then I think the first thing that I take away from this is, and this is something that was brought up in multiple different things that I've read, and it's a notion that's been considered multiple different times, but the idea that a genocide has been in place in this country when it comes to black people, that there have been systematic and systemic things that have went on in this society that to lead to the extermination of black people. And when you read things like this, when you know about the history of cocaine and drugs, not even just cocaine, but drugs being basically pushed into black communities, when you know about the type of effects that deindustrialization has had on black communities, when you know about the effects of mass incarceration, the prison to school pipelines, the miseducation of children, and then when you, as we going through this book is talking about things that are specifically unique to women, to black women, women in general, women of color in general, but specifically black women. And when you think about the sterilization of hundreds of thousands, essentially, if you add these numbers up through years, millions of black women without their consent, then when you add that to the layer of things that have happened in this society that lead to people to make the claims of an attempted genocide, of an ongoing attempts of genocide that is being done in this society, in this country, when it comes to black people. When you read things like this, it lets you understand why the black community has not only small trust in the government, because you see that the government is involved in every step of this way, in this eugenics and these sterilizations, but also why black people as a community have such small trust when it comes to the medical field and when it comes to doctors and medical departments. And because of the history, there's not an institution in this society that has not exploited or oppressed, violated the rights of black people. And again, when you talk about this country, the hypocrisy of this country, to condemn other countries for actions that this country has consistently done to black people, to people of color. And so the condemnation that you will hear for the things that Hitler did to Jewish people in Europe during the times in which his dictatorship was reigning, those things were being done at the same time period to black people in this country here, in this society here. Given the historical genocide inflicted on the native population of the United States, one would assume that Native American Indians would be exempted from the government's sterilization campaign. But according to Dr. Kami Uri's testimony in a Senate committee hearing, by 1976, some 24% of all Indian women of childbearing age have been sterilized. Quote, "Our bloodlines are being stopped," end quote, the Choctaw physician told the Senate committee. Quote, "Our unborn will not be born. This is genocidal to our people," end quote. According to Dr. Uri, the Indian Health Services Hospital in Claremore, Oklahoma, have been sterilizing 1 out of every 4 women giving birth in that federal facility. Native American Indians are special targets of government propaganda on sterilization. In one of the HEW pamphlets aimed at Indian people, there is a sketch of a family with 10 children and 1 horse, and another sketch of a family with 1 child and 10 horses. The drawings are supposed to imply that more children mean more poverty and fewer children mean wealth, as if the 10 horses owned by the 1-child family have been magically conjured up by birth control and sterilization surgery. The domestic population policy of the U.S. government has an undeniably racist edge. Native American, Chicana, Puerto Rican, and black women continue to be sterilized in disproportionate numbers. According to a national fertility study conducted in 1970 by Princeton University's Office of Population Control, 20% of all married black women have been permanently sterilized. Approximately the same percentage of Chicana women have been rendered surgically infertile. Moreover, 43% of the women sterilized through federally subsidized programs were black. The astonishing number of Puerto Rican women who have been sterilized reflects a special government policy that can be traced back to 1939. In that year, President Roosevelt's Interdepartmental Committee on Puerto Rico issued a statement attributing the island's economic problems to the phenomenon of overpopulation. This committee proposed that efforts be undertaken to reduce the birth rate to no more than the level of the death rate. Soon afterward, an experimental sterilization campaign was undertaken in Puerto Rico. Although the Catholic Church initially opposed this experiment and forced the cessation of the program in 1946, it was converted during the early 1950s to the teachings and practice of population control. In this period, over 150 birth control clinics were opened, resulting in a 20% decline in population growth by the mid-1960s. By the 1970s, over 35% of all Puerto Rican women of childbearing age have been surgically sterilized. According to Bonnie Maz, a serious critic of the U.S. government's population policy, quote, "If purely mathematical projections are to be taken seriously, if the present rate of sterilization of 19,000 monthly were to continue, then the island's population of workers and peasants could be extinguished within the next 10 to 20 years. Establishing for the first time in world history a systematic use of population control capable of eliminating an entire generation of people," end quote. During the 1970s, the devastating implications of the Puerto Rican experiment began to emerge with unmistakable clarity. In Puerto Rico, the presence of corporations in the highly automated metallurgical and pharmaceutical industries had exacerbated the problem of unemployment. The prospect of an ever larger army of unemployed workers was one of the main incentives for the mass sterilization program. Inside the United States today, enormous numbers of people of color, and especially racially oppressed youth, have become part of a pool of permanently unemployed workers. It is hardly coincidental, considering the Puerto Rican example, that the increasing incidence of sterilization has kept pace with the high rates of unemployment. Excuse me, I said that P kind of hard. Pushing P. As growing numbers of white people suffer the brutal consequences of unemployment, they can also expect to become targets of the official sterilization propaganda. The prevalence of sterilization abuse during the latter 1970s may be greater than ever before. Although the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare issued guidelines in 1974, which were ostensibly designed to prevent involuntary sterilizations, the situation has nonetheless deteriorated. When the American Civil Liberties Union Reproductive Freedom Project conducted a survey of teaching hospitals in 1975, they discovered that 40% of those institutions were not even aware of the regulations issued by the HEW. Only 30% of the hospitals examined by the ACLU were even attempting to comply with the guidelines. The 1977 Hyde Amendment has added yet another dimension to coercive sterilization practices. As a result of this law passed by Congress, federal funds for abortions were eliminated in all cases but those involving rape and the risk of death or severe illness. According to Sandra Salazar of the California Department of Public Health, the first victim of the Hyde Amendment was a 27-year-old Chicana woman from Texas. She died as a result of an illegal abortion in Mexico shortly after Texas discontinued government-funded abortions. There have been many more victims, women for whom sterilization has become the only alternative to the abortions, which are currently beyond their reach. Sterilizations continue to be federally funded and free to poor women on demand. Over the last decade, the struggle against sterilization abuse has been waged primarily by Puerto Rican, Black, Chicana, and Native American women. Their cause has not yet been embraced by the women's movement as a whole. Within organizations representing the interests of middle-class white women, there has been a certain reluctance to support the demands of the campaign against sterilization abuse, for these women are often denied their individual rights to be sterilized when they desire to take this step. While women of color are urged, at every turn, to become permanently infertile, white women enjoying prosperous economic conditions are urged, by the same forces, to reproduce themselves. They therefore sometimes consider the, quote, waiting period, end quote, and other details of the demand for, quote, informed consent, end quote, to sterilization as further inconveniences for women like themselves. Yet whatever the inconveniences for white middle-class women, a fundamental reproductive right of racially oppressed and poor women is at stake. Sterilization abuse must be ended. And then that brings us to the end of Chapter 12, Racism, Birth Control, and Reproductive Rights. And that brings us to the beginning of Chapter 13. And I'm going to take a moment to end this segment, and then I'm going to pop back up and do a reflection on this chapter. All right. So one of the things that I think has been very important about this book has been that, for me personally, this may be the first book I've read involving the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice that was uniquely tailored towards speaking on the women's perspective and giving the vantage point of women. I began to read Invisible No More for one of the Rockford readings that was going on, but I did not get all the way through that book. And we're virtually all the way through this book. We have one more chapter left to read. And I'm understanding the deeper I got into this book, the deeper I understood the common mistakes that all these different movements in our society have made is recreating some of these same systems or some of these same marginalizations and subjugation. What up? Recreating those same things within movements, within subjugated groups, within marginalized groups. And we've seen how within the marginalized, subjugated, oppressed, exploited group that is women in the United States of American society, as they begin to create movements to try to liberate those women, they recreated that same subjugation, exploitation, and oppression within those movements. And it was geared, instead of being towards genders, or it was geared towards race. It was geared towards class. And so working class women became subjugated, while middle class white women were put on a higher pedestal. Black women and Chicana women and Puerto Rican women were exploited as white middle class women were reaping the benefits of some of those exploitations. And I think that another one of the things that stood out to me about that specific chapter is pointing out all of these different institutions which have failed women, all of these different ways that these institutions have failed women, and how the government has been complicit in these things, how the government has been a part of these different things, and how it's not simply just an individual thing that has to be dealt with when it comes to the oppression of women, but it is ideological things that have to be dealt with. It is institutional things that have to be dealt with. And I think that a lot of times, and even myself, a lot of times when people, and this happens with race and with class as well, sometimes people think that just because they individually, well, you're individually not misogynistic, or you individually believe that in equity and inequality for women, but we have to do things, and that's okay. You know, that's a step, and that's a beginning process. But just like with racism, it's not enough to just individually struggle or overcome some of these things. You have to be actively trying to rid the society of these institutional things, and you have to constantly be every day struggling since you're existing in a society that's built around the exploitation of women, oppression of women. You have to every day be struggling against that exploitation, against that oppression, against that marginalization and subjugation and objectification. And I think that the only way to accurately and adequately do that with all of these things is to regularly be taking in information from a woman's perspective, regularly be trying to struggle with ways to articulate ideology that encompasses not just what is good for yourself as a man, or myself, I'm speaking for myself personally, myself as a black man, but what is good for black people as a whole, including black women. And so I think that that's one of the things that is echoed throughout these chapters, echoed throughout these pages, is that movement building needs to be inclusive of whole communities. And so I learned a lot about the sterilization. Those were all things that, you know, as I was receiving this information, I haven't known these type of specifics before. I've had small little pieces about eugenics. This has been the most I've learned, or most information I've taken in as a whole about these subjects. So a lot of these things are still newly being introduced to me. So some of these things are a little bit more difficult for me to try to articulate correlations to. And I think that that's part of the importance of reading these different pieces of literature, of every day actively being engaged with these different ideologies, with these different philosophies, with these different issues, is that it gets us into a place where a week from now, or 2 weeks from now, or a month from now, 2 months from now, we can better articulate some of these things as we continue to add these different pieces of literature to our mental Rolodex. So we're going to end this episode here, and then the next episode we will begin reading the final chapter of Angela Y. Davis's Women, Race, and Class. All right, share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and we'll be back tomorrow with a new episode.